We're going to look at sharpening the spearfish using artificial intelligence.
Hey, Brian. So what interesting story do you have for us today?
Well, I was actually, I try to keep up on a few things, and credit to Bruce Schneider on this. He's been doing a blog on cybersecurity activities for quite some time, and I find that he brings a little bit of a different perspective in the types of things that he brings to the table. Perhaps a little bit more on the academic side, but he has some practical things as well, and he has a lot of good practical experience in cybersecurity. So this is one that happened to show up in his cyber blog this month. And, I've kind of retitled it because I wanted it to be a little bit flashy. It's about sharpening the spearfish using AI. And this was actually an article that was, or a topic that was talked about at DEF CON. And the authors associated with this are Lim, Tan, Hawk, and Lee. I think they specifically said they were not associated with or not affiliated with a specific organization, but cooperated on this research. And really what they, we've been talking about, for years about the potential for artificial intelligence to be used in attacks. And this is specifically some research along those lines. And, I think a lot of organizations have been caught up in the, I'll call it the hype of artificial intelligence. Those that understand artificial intelligence realize that it's very difficult to apply artificial intelligence to specific problems. And in fact, they even cover in their slides that are, available on the DEF CON site, they cover, sort of this notion of hype around artificial intelligence and its ability to be applied to things. And, we've hypothesized about how artificial intelligence could be used in attacks. But quite frankly, I've never really seen very many that would be all that practical. We talked about, being able to find attacks or find exploits and those types of things. But the reality is most of the attackers really just take whatever tool they have, and then when they find another exploit that might work, they add that new tool. I mean, and so it's just a conglomeration of tools. And, perhaps it comes to the point where you need some sort of artificial or logic flow to decide which is the most efficient way to do an exploit and, maybe the least or the most stealthy. But aside from that, this particular one, I think, is one that we kind of need to watch out for. Now, again, this is research. But what they're using is artificial intelligence, and particularly the OpenAI's GPT-3 API, to craft spear-phishing messages. And, when we think about spear-phishing messages, obviously we've seen a lot of cases where, messages have been generated automatically and then sent out, but it's not a spearfish. It's not crafted for specific individuals. It's really just kind of doing carpet bombing. And what they were doing is actually using information to craft messages so that they were targeting specific individuals in an automated way. And they were claiming that they were getting, a higher success rate at generating clicks and prompting users to fill out forms with what they refer to as conversion rates up to 80%, which is pretty significant. I think in typical, phishing activities, you can expect maybe around 30% if you have a relatively trained crowd, maybe 50% if they're not trained, and they're claiming around 80%. So it appears that they were able to craft things that were targeted towards specific individuals, do it in an automated way, and do it in a way that was more convincing and could get particular folks. And the expectation is that this could develop further. If you can think of all of the sources of social media, perhaps postings, if you can associate with those with specific individuals, you might be able to craft messages that would be very much appealing to their interests and very convincing in a way that they might be able to really get greater, I'll say, take rate on spear phishing activity. So the threat here, and I think Bruce Schneider himself kind of pointed out, was that the concern here is not necessarily that you get really good spear phishing necessarily, although it will get better. It's that they can do it at a much higher volume, targeted attacks at high volume. That's, from an attacker's point of view, is very lucrative, potentially lucrative. in the discussion, they also talk about how to defend it, and the presentation talked a little bit more about, mathematical methods. Of course, the folks here, they're using the hammer of mathematical methods and artificial intelligence as their tooling here, and so they were looking at methods to actually detect synthetic text, and I think that's perhaps something that should be done. You may have seen things about deep fakes and trying to detect deep fakes so that they don't end up in the news. That's certainly a related field that folks are looking at. But when I start thinking about protecting against this kind of thing, I think that's my challenge to you, Stan and Manny. I'd like to get your thoughts on how you would approach protecting against this type of threat. And I have a couple of things to feed in here, but first to get your thoughts if you have any.
Well, the way that I'll start is by saying that a few years ago, I was part of a pen test. And in our pen test, phishing was something that we employed as a technique to get onto people's PCs. And we got, I'm happy to say, although also sorry to say, 100% click rate because our messaging was so good and our pages that we created were so awesome that it was just impossible for people not to click on them. Even at the, I guess, at the risk of our exploit not being perfect. In fact, we spent so much time crafting the phishing email that we forgot to make the exploit really easy to execute. And it actually required user interaction, like to install the payload. And I remember as part of the team debating, hey, will this work? Will people get to this point and kind of stop and our whole thing would fail? And we're kind of coming up against the deadline. We said, no, you know what? Let's just add an instruction page. When they get there, let's give them the instructions of how exactly to install the payload. And let's see if they follow it. And with that, with those simple instructions and some red arrows, we had 100% success rate on our pen test. So from that perspective, I could see when you have targeting and when the message is appealing and when you're able to do everything, it does become really, really difficult to stop that human emotion from hey, I got to do this. I got to click on it. And hey, here's some instructions to follow, and I'm going to follow them too, even though I have no idea what I'm doing. It's actually my son, this happened to him recently too, where he was playing some game and he got tricked. And it was basically social engineering. And they provided him with a set of instructions to follow that allowed him to take over his control. He lost all his video game currency and everything that he'd been storing up. And at the end of it, I asked him one simple question. I'm like, can you tell me what you were doing here? And he was like, yeah, I was trying to get whatever thing. And I'm like, what was the bad guy doing? And he said, they were trying to hack into my account. I was like, yeah, who won?
That'll be a lesson he'll keep forever.
I hope so.
Especially the indifference from his dad and the whole thing.
So I think, from that standpoint, it's really difficult for me to think of, how do you get by on that human nature when it's super targeted like that, when they're using, let's say, your Twitter feed, and they're trying to figure out, what have you been up to? Let's say your message is exactly having to do with the problems you're experiencing in your life right now. And it is really difficult for people to probably get by on that. In fact, if you think about all the advertising that we go through, all that is designed to tap into our psychology, make sure we click the button. So I think the bad guys have our number. Maybe I'll think about it a little more as I hear Manny's response to solving the challenge.
So that was a very elaborate and very elongated stall tactic that you did there, Stan. So you had the opportunity to think through your non-answer. Well, let me just stick one out there, and then perhaps Manny can expand on this, because I know these, some of the things are obvious to us because we've been doing them for years. They're not necessarily foolproof in their own right, but what I tend to do is think about protecting against the consequences as opposed to trying to protect against the human target. Now, obviously, I mean, as you pointed out, Stan, human emotions, we're not going to change the fact that we're humans. We're not going to certainly change the fact that there are lots of humans with different emotions, and eventually you might not get 100% take rate, but you want to try to reduce that. But when we think about the motivation of a phish, well, what are those motivations, and what are the things that we can get past? Now, I didn't think really much about giving instructions on how to bypass all these controls, but one of the things is, for example, to have controls in the proxies to block unrecognized URLs. We kind of take that for granted because we've been doing it for years, but it's a really important thing. And then there are tools that are out there that are designed for very highly protected environments to whitelist only the business necessary URLs, so that phishers are generally trying to get you to click on a URL and do something perhaps behind it, and there may be another motivation as well. But that's one that I'd come up with. Manny, I don't want to steal any thunder if you have any in hand.
No, I mean, so I think this is, this is, again, a very interesting topic, and I think there's a thousand different ways that this can go. And from a protection perspective, I think I agree that it is difficult. One thing that I think that I would think of in a situation like this, because as you explained, Brian, it's the bad actors going in and using, basically turning a technology around for their own use, right? Mm-hmm. And so they figured out a way that, like, hey, that engine is pretty smart. I can take that engine and I can turn around and start bringing in other data, just like we do on a daily basis for protecting our own networks. They start bringing in data sources into this model to help them out with their tasks, just like it helps us with our tasks. So mm-hmm. One of the first things I would probably say is to, again, it's use AI against AI, right? It's your AI against their AI, and how much data can you put into yours? How much intelligence can you put into yours and make your AI smarter than theirs, or at least mm-hmm. quicker to the punch, right? Yep. So I think some of the things you've talked about are some of the things that we would do, right? Is we would have, this engine that's looking at, things like, hey, let's look at all of the, the domains that our people are visiting, and use mm-hmm. that as a tactic for determining when you have something that's potentially malicious. The other thing that I would say is, and I think you've already covered this, training is something that you have to do, right? I mean, it's the human side. You have to do that. It's like you can't ignore it, even though we all know how effective it is. It's only effective helps. To a certain, right? It helps, yep. But it's not going to be a 100% silver bullet. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one area. But I think the other thing is, and I kind of hate to jump to this, but there are a lot of companies out there that specialize in this area, right? And so don't think that you have to always take on something like this on your own, because there are companies out there that specialize in looking at email from a phishing perspective, and they do a really good job of taking data, not only from data that comes from your own company, but from other people's emails. So they're looking at it from a holistic perspective, and they're mm-hmm. able to see things that we can't even see ourselves. So I would say, don't discount going off and finding somebody else that, spends literally 24/7 working on this problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you make a good point there. That is, to try to solve it yourself is probably not the best path, and particularly when you get into highly sophisticated attacks like this. In terms of crafting the message itself. One of the things this group did not do, to near as I could tell, maybe they did in the background, but most of their reporting in terms of finding a defense against this was looking at the text of the message itself, whereas threat analysts, I think, would broadly look at the entire context of the message. Did it come from a place that you would expect it to come from? Do you see other messages with similar kinds of context around it? It's more than likely that if they do send lots of spear phishing messages, they might point back to a similar or a common destination point, but have different messaging around each one, which would be a suggestion of something trend-wise that you could pick up on. And the last but not least here that I was thinking about is something near and dear to my heart, because I'm responsible for identity and authentication capabilities in AT&T is use of phish-resistant authentication. You know, one of the challenges, I mean, there are two fundamental motivations that I see that threat actors are trying to do: get you to click on a URL that takes you to someplace, and then the other would be to try to collect authentication credentials. And you know, some of the two-factor solutions that exist today, that is specifically ones that are based on SMS messages and others that have basically a passcode, even though it's a one-time passcode, those two can be social engineered or phished from users and used to bypass what is, you know, theoretically two-factor authentication. The reality is, I think we need to get to not just two-factor authentication, but step it up as a industry standard to phish-resistant authentication. A lot of the newer solutions that exist out there, there are hardware-based ones, mobile device-based ones. I'll just go ahead and put a plug in for ZenKey because that's one that we've partnered with other carriers on to make mobile devices into authentication devices and tie it to the SIM cards. But they all use solutions that don't put the person in the middle of basically passing codes between applications and authenticators to support the authentication process. And that makes them much more resistant to this type of attack.